Geirlaug, the king's daughter. One day, a powerful king and his beautiful wife were sitting in the gardens of their capital city, talking earnestly about the future life of their little son, who was sleeping by their side in his golden cradle. They had been married for many years without children, so when this baby came along, they thought themselves the happiest couple in the whole world. He was a fine, sturdy little boy who loved to kick and to strive out with his fists. But if he had been weak and small, they would have still thought him the most wonderful creature upon earth. And so absorbed were they in making plans for him that they never noticed a huge shadow creeping up, till a horrible head with gleaming teeth stretched over them, and in an instant their beloved baby was snatched away. For a while, the king and queen remained where they were, speechless with horror. The king then rose slowly, and holding out his hand to his wife, led her weeping into the palace, and for many days their subjects saw no more of them. Meanwhile, the dragon soared high into the air, holding the cradle between his teeth, and the baby still slept on. He flew so fast that he soon crossed the borders of another kingdom, and again he beheld the king and queen of that country seated in the garden, with a little girl lying in a wonderful cradle of white satin and lace. Swooping down from behind, as he had done before, just was about to seize the cradle when the king jumped up and dealt him such a blow with his golden staff that the dragon not only started back, but in his pain let fall the boy, and spread his wings and soared into the air away from all danger. That was a narrow escape, said the king, turning to his wife, who sat pale with fright, and clasped her baby tightly in her arms. Frightful, murmured the queen. But look, what's that glittering object that is lying out there? The king walked in that direction of her finger, and to his astonishment beheld another cradle with another baby. Ah, the monster must have stolen this, and as he sought to steal Geirlaug, and stooping lower, he read some words that were written on the fine linen that was wound about the baby. This is Grethari, son of Grethari the king. Unfortunately, it happened to be that the two neighboring monarchs had had a serious quarrel, and for some years had ceased holding communications with each other. As kings do. So instead of sending a messenger at once to Grethari to tell him of the safety of his son, the king contented himself with adopting the boy, which was brought up with Geirlaug, the princess. For a few while, um, things went well with the children, who were happy as the day was long. At last there came a time when the queen could no more run races or play hide and seek with them in the garden, as she was so fond of doing, but lay and watched them from a pile of soft cushions. By and by, she gave up even on doing that, and the people of the palace spoke with low voices. And even Geirlaug and Grethari trod gently and moved quietly when they drew near her room. At length, one morning, they were sent for by the king himself, his red eyes from weeping told them that the queen was dead. Great was the sorrow of the two children, for they had loved the queen very dearly, and life seemed dull without her. But the lady in waiting who took care of them in the tower, which had been built for them while they were still babies, was good and kind, and when the king was busy or away in other parts of the kingdom, She made them quite happy, and saw that they were taught everything that a prince and princess ought to know. Thus, 2 or 3 years passed, when one day, as the children were anxiously awaiting their father's return from a distant city, there rode post haste into the courtyard of the palace a herald whom the king had sent before him, to say he was bringing back a new wife. Bum, bum. Now, in itself, there was nothing very strange or dreadful in the fact that the king should marry again. But, as the old lady in waiting soon guessed, the queen, despite her beauty, was a witch. And, and it was easy to see that she was jealous of everyone who might gain power over her husband. It boded ill for Geirlaug and Grethari. The faithful woman could not sleep for thinking about her charges, and her soul sank a few months after the marriage, as war broke out with the country across the seas, and the king rode away at the head of his troops. Then there happened what she had so long expected. One night, when, unlike her usual habit, she was sleeping soundly. Afterwards, she felt sure that a drug had been put into her food. The witch came to the tower. Exactly what she did there, no one knew. But when the sun rose, the beds of Grethari and Geirlaug were empty. At dawn, the queen summoned some of her guards and told them that she had been warned in a dream that some evil fate would befall her through a wild beast, and bade them go out and kill every animal within 2 miles of the palace. But only beasts that were found were 2 black foals of wondrous beauty, fitted for the king's riding, so it seemed a pity to kill them. For what harm could 2 little foals do anyone? So they let them run away, frisking over the plain, and returned to the palace. "Did you see nothing? Really nothing?" asked the queen when they again appeared before her. "Nothing, your majesty," they replied. But the queen did not believe them, and when they were gone, she gave orders to her steward that the supper of the guards should be well piled with strong drink, so that their tongues should be loosened, and further that he was to give heed to their babble and report to her whatever they might fall. "Your Majesty's commands have been obeyed," said the steward, when, late in the evening, he begged admittance to her royal apartments. "But after all, the men have told you the truth. I listened to their talk from the beginning and end. They did nothing to see save for 2 black foals." He might have added more, but the look from the queen's blazing eyes terrified him, and bowing hastily, he backed quickly out of her presence. In a week's time the king came home, and right glad were all the courtiers to see him. "Now, perhaps you will find someone else to scream at," whispered they among themselves. She was the queen, and who had vented her rage on her attendants during those days, though what had happened to make her so angry, no one knew. But whatever might be the meaning of it, things would be sure to improve with the king to rule in the palace instead of his wife. Unfortunately, their joy lasted only a short while. For the very first night after the king's arrival, the queen related the evil dream that he had dreamt in his absence, and begged him to go out the next morning and kill every living creature he saw within 2 miles of the city. The king, who always believed everything the queen said, promised to do as she wished. But before he had ridden through the lovely gardens that surrounded the palace, he was attracted by the singing of two little bluebirds perched on a scarlet-berried holly, which made him think of two beautiful that they had never heard or that he had ever imagined. Hour after hour passed by, and still the birds sang, and still the king listened, though of course he never guessed that it was Geirlaug and Bethari whose notes filled him with enchantment. As darkness fell, the birds' voices were hushed, and the king awoke with a start to find that his day of promise to the queen had not been kept. "Well, did you see anything?" she asked eagerly when the king entered her apartments. Um, my dear, I am most ashamed to confess to you. But the fact is, before I rode as far as the western gate, the two singing strange little bluebirds made me forget all else in the world. And you will hardly believe it, but not until it grew dark did I remember where I was and what I should have been doing. However, tomorrow shall hinder me from not fulfilling your desires." "There will be no tomorrow," muttered the queen, as she turned away with her curious glitter in her eyes. But the king did not hear her. That night, the king gave a great supper in the palace in honor of the victory he had gained over the enemy. 3 men whom the queen had sent forth to slay the wild beasts held positions in trust in the household, for to them was committed the custody of the queen's person. And on the occasion of the feasts, their places were always next to that of the king, so it was easy for the queen to scatter a slow but fatal poison in their cups without anyone being the wiser. Before dawn, the palace was roused by the news that the king was dead, and that the 3 officers of the guards were dying also. Of course, nobody's cries and laments were as loud as those of the queen. But once, when the splendid funeral was over, she gave out that she was going to shut herself up in a distant castle till the year of her mourning was over. And after appointing a regent of the kingdom, she set out, attended only by a maid, who knew all her secrets. Once she had left the palace, she quickly began to work her spells to discover under what form Geirlaug and Bethari lay hidden. Happily, the princess had studied magic under a former governess, and was able to fathom her stepmother's wicked plot, and hastily changed herself into a whale, and her foster brother into its fin. Then the queen took the shape of a shark and gave chase. After several hours, a fierce battle raged between the whale and the shark, and the sea around was red with blood. First one of the combatants got the better, and then the other. But at length it became plain to the crowd of little fishes gathered around to watch that the victory would be to the whale. And so it was. But when, after a mighty struggle, the shark floated dead and harmless on the surface of the water, the whale was so exhausted that she had only strength enough to drag her wounded body into a quiet little bay. And for 3 days she remained there, still and motionless, as if she had been dead herself. At the end of the 3 days her wounds were healed, and she began to think what it was best to do. "Let us go back to your father's kingdom," she said to Bethari, when they had both resumed their proper shapes, and were sitting upon a high cliff above the sea. "How clever you are! I never should have thought of that," answered Bethari, who, in truth, was not clever at all. But Geirlaug took a small box of white powder from her dress, and sprinkled some over him and some over herself. And, quicker than lightning, they found themselves in the palace grounds from which Guthari had been carried off by the dragon so many years before. "Now, take up the band with the golden letters and bind it with your forehead," said Geirlaug, "and go boldly up to the castle. And remember, however great may be your thirst, you must drink nothing until you have first spoken to your father. If you do, ill will befall us both." "Why should I be thirsty?" replied Guthari, staring at her in astonishment. "It will not take me 5 minutes to reach the castle gate." Geirlaug held her peace, but her eyes had in them a sad look. "Goodbye," she said at last, and she turned and kissed him. Guthari had spoken truly that he declared that he could easily get to the castle in 5 minutes. At least, no one would have dreamed that it would possibly take longer. Yet, to his surprise, the door, which stood so widely open that he could see the color of the hangings, then never appeared to grow any nearer. While each moment the sun burned more hotly, and his tongue was parched with thirst. "I don't understand. What can be the matter with me? And why haven't I reached the castle long ago?" he murmured to himself, as his knees began to lock under him with fatigue, and his head would swim. A few more paces he staggered on blindly. Suddenly, the sound of rushing water smote upon his ears, and a little wood that bordered the path had beheld a stream falling over a rock. At this, his sight to Geirlaug was forgotten. Fighting his way through the brambles that tore his clothes, he cast himself down beside the fountain, and seizing the golden cup that hung from a tree, he drank a deep draught. When he rose, the remembrance of Geirlaug and of his past life had vanished, and instead something stirred dimly within him at the vision of a white-haired man and woman who stood in the open door with outstretched hands. "Guthari, Guthari, you have come home at last!" they cried. For 3 hours, Geirlaug waited in the spot where Guthari had left her, and then she began to understand what had happened. Her heart was heavy, but she soon made up her mind what to do, and pushing her way out of the wood, she skirted the high wall that enclosed the royal park and gardens, till she reached a small house where the forester lived with his 2 daughters. "Do you want to go to sweep and milk the cows?" she asked one of the sisters who answered her knock. "Yes, you do very badly, and you look strong and clean. We will take you for a servant if you would like to come," replied the young woman. "But first, what is your name?" Lafertha," said Geirlaug quickly, for she did not wish anyone to know who she was, and following her new mistress into the house, she begged her to be taught to work without delay. So clever was she that by and by it began to be noised about the strange girl had come to live in the forester's house, had not her equal in the whole kingdom for her skill, as well as her beauty. Thus the years slipped away, during which Geirlaug grew to be a woman. Now and then she caught glimpses of Guthari as he rode out to hunt in the forest, but when she saw him coming she hid herself behind the great trees, for her heart was still sore at his forgetfulness. One day, however, when she was gathering herbs, he came upon her suddenly, before she had time to escape, as though she had stained her face and hands brown, and covered her beautiful hair with a scarlet cap. He did not guess her to be his foster sister. "Oh, what is your name, pretty maiden?" he asked. "Lafertha," answered the girl with a low curtsy. Ah, it is you, then, of whom I have heard so much, he said. You are too beautiful to spend your life serving a foster's daughters. Come with me to the palace, and my mother the queen will make you one of her ladies-in-waiting.
Truly, that would be a great fortune, replied the maiden. And if you really mean it, I will go with you. But how shall I know that you are not jesting?
Give me anything to do for you, and I will do it, whatever it is, cried the young man eagerly, and she cast her eyes down and answered,
Go to the stable and bind the calf that is there, so that it shall not break loose in the night and wander away. For the forester and his daughters have treated me well, and I would not leave them without my work still undone.
So Grithari set out for the stable where the calf stood, and wound the rope around its horns. But when he had made it fast to the wall, he found that the coil of rope had twisted itself around his wrists, and, as pull as he might, he could not get free. All night he wriggled and struggled, till he was half dead with fatigue. But when the sun rose, the rope suddenly fell away from him. Very angry with the maiden, he dragged himself back to the palace. She's a witch, he muttered crossly to himself, and I'll have no more to do with her. And he flung himself on his bed and slept all day. Not long after this adventure, the king and queen sent their beloved son on an embassy to a neighboring country to seek a bride from among 7 princesses. The most beautiful of all was, of course, the one chosen, and the young pair took ship without delay for the kingdom of the prince's parents. The wind was fair, and the vessel so swift that, in less time than could have been expected, the harbor nearest the castle was reached. A splendid carriage had been left in readiness close to the beach, but no horses were to be found, for everyone had been carried off to take part of a great review which the king was told that day in honor of his son's marriage.
I can't stay here all day, said the princess crossly,
when Grithari told her of the plight they were in.
I am perfectly worn out as this is, and you will have to find something to draw the carriage, if it is only a donkey. If you don't, I will go straight right back to my father.
Poor Grithari was much troubled by the words of the princess. Not that he felt so very much in love with her. During the voyage she had shown him several times how vain and bad-tempered she was. But as a prince and as a bridegroom he could not, of course, bear to think that any slight had been put upon her. So he hastily bade his attendants to go in search of some animal, and bring it at once to the place at which they were waiting. During the long pause, the princess sat in the beautiful golden coach, her blue velvet mantle powdered with silver bees drawn closely round her, so that not even the tip of her nose could be seen. At length the girl appeared driving a young ox in front of her, followed by one of the prince's messengers, who was talking eagerly. "Will you lend me your ox, fair maiden?" asked Grithari, jumping up and down to meet them. "You shall fix your own price, and it shall be paid ungrudgingly, for never before was king's son in such a plight."
My price is seats for me and my 2 friends behind you, and your bride at the wedding feast, she answered.
And to this Grithari joyfully consented. 6 horses could not have drawn the coach at the speed that one ox did. Trees and fields flew by so fast that the bride became quite giddy. and expected, besides, that they would be very upset every moment. But in spite of her fears, nothing happened, and they drew up in safety to the door of the palace, and to the great surprise of the king and queen. The marriage preparations were hurried on, and by the end of the week everything was ready. It was perhaps fortunate that the princess was too busy with her new clothes and her jewels during this period to pay much heed to Bethari, so that by the time the wedding day had come around she had almost forgotten how cross and rude she had been during the journey. The oldest men and women in the town agreed that nothing so splendid had ever been seen as the bridal procession to the great hall, where the banquet was to be held. Before the ceremony was celebrated in the palace, the princess was in high good humor, feeling that all the eyes were upon her, and bowed and smiled right and left. Taking the prince's hand, she sailed proudly down the room, where the guests were already assembled, to her place at the head of the table by the side of her bridegroom. As she did so, three strange ladies in shining dresses of blue, green, and red glided in and seated themselves on the vacant bench immediately behind the young couple. The red lady was Geirlaug, who had brought with her the forester's daughters, and in one hand she held a wand of birch bark, and in the other a closed basket. Silently they sat as the feast proceeded. Hardly anyone noticed their presence, or, if they did, supposed them to be attendants of the future queen. Suddenly, when the merriment was at its height, Geirlaug opened the basket, and out flew a cock and hen. To the astonishment of everyone, the birds circled about in front of the royal pair, the cock plucking feathers out of the tail of the hen, who tried to escape him in vain. Hmm. "Will you treat me as badly as Grothari treated Geirlaug?" cried the hen at last. And Grothari heard, and started up wildly. In an instant, all the past rushed to him. The princess by his side was forgotten, and he only saw the face of the child with whom he had played long years ago. "Where's Geirlaug?" he exclaimed, looking round the hall. His eyes fell upon the strange lady. With a smile, she held out a ring which he had given her on her 12th birthday, when they were still children, without a thought of the future. "You and none other shall be my wife," he said, taking her hand and leading her into the middle of the company. It is not easy to describe the scene that followed. Of course, nobody really understood what had occurred, and the king and queen imagined that their son had suddenly gone mad. As for the princess, her rage and fury were beyond belief. The guests left the hall as quickly as they could so that the royal family might arrange their own affairs. And in the end, it was settled that half of the kingdom must be given to the despised princess instead of a husband. She sailed back at once to her country, where she was soon betrothed to a young noble, whom, in reality, she liked much better than Grothari. That evening, Grothari was married to Geirlaug, and they lived happily till they died, and made all their people happy, too.